Afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's had a good afternoon. This talk specifically has two parts to it, really. The main chunk of it is I wanted to just provide a summary of some research I've had published this year with Dr. David Fletcher at Loughborough University and Professor Kevin Daniels at the University of East Anglia. This was a study looking at organisational stress in sports, particularly with a professional rugby
You
union.
too. Shush. You should be getting on with homework.
And and also just
getting on with homework. Right, go sit at the table, get on with homework, please.
On occupational stress in work context. Okay, if we can mute audio, guys, that'd be great. So just conscious of time, I think it's really important that the research that I talk about evidences that there is some theoretical underpinning. So I'm not going to touch on this in too much detail, but just those of you that are interested in understanding some of the theoretical frameworks that inform the research on organizational and occupational stress in sport and other performance contexts. There are three key theories and models that typically inform this research. And I think the easiest way to summarize this focus is predominantly around the idea of the demands and the resources that we encounter and we seek. So typically one way in which we can adapt to stress in the workplace and other performance environments is to seek resources, to draw upon the resources that we have available to us. In terms of the study that we've had published this year, this is essentially the main purpose of the study that we conducted. We were interested in looking at less of a focus on the organizational events or the stresses that people often think might lead to well-being and performance outcomes, but more the mediating processes that we would call that are linked to stress from a theoretical perspective. And these include the cognitive evaluations that we make in relation to our organizational environments, and we make these evaluations in relation to our goals and our well-being. And it's theorized that that in turn can motivate how we may try to cope with the various organizational demands and workplace demands that we might encounter. There's also a theoretical argument, and this hasn't really been approached in sports psychology research, which is how we manage stress might also be the result of our personal dispositions and various situational contexts as well. So we wanted to explore this in more detail. The other contribution we wanted to make was a methodological one. We wanted to spend less time looking at highly retrospective data, asking people how they've experienced stress in the last 2 years or the last month or the last week. And we wanted to try and measure data as it was occurring for these professional rugby union players in their training and competition environment. So what we essentially did was we had 39 players who were professional rugby union academy players within a squad, and this was from one of Europe's most successful professional rugby union teams, or at least one of their academy teams, should I say. And what we did just to start off with, rather than in terms of kind of setting up the study, we collected some demographic data. We collected some data in relation to people's personality dispositions. We identified players playing position, and we also spoke to the coaching and support staff to get a sense of who the players are in the squad that could be considered key decision makers, because again, this can have clear links to how teams work together and also link to people's stress experience. Our main data collection took an experience sampling methodological approach, and the way we did this was we one of my colleagues had a large research grant previously in organizational psychology, where they had hundreds of these personal digital assistants, and you don't see too many of these days, but ultimately what they allow you to do is collect data as people are experiencing stress within their workplace. So we took this approach. We had 40 or just under 40 of these personal digital assistants. We handed these to each player and we asked them to complete a 20-item questionnaire, pretty quick. You can do it within a minute or two. And essentially, we asked players to complete this personal digital assistant twice a day for a week for a total of 5 weeks. And I would go and collect the data at the end of each week and essentially synchronize the data into in software packages. And what we did was we asked the players in the morning and the afternoon of each day to reflect on organizational events that they've encountered in the previous hour. And we'd ask them how they in turn appraised, responded in terms of their emotions, and how they tried to cope with those organizational events in the past hour. And because we were interested in looking at these statistical relationships, but also as a function of between group differences at a different level, we conducted some multi-level regressions using hierarchical linear modeling software. Now, something quite unique happened with this study, and that's partly why I wanted to present this, which was not only was I new to teaching at the time when we finished collecting the data, I had a little bit less time to do research, but also we had a few knockbacks from a couple of high-profile journals. So there was a time lag between when the data was collected. And as a result of that, what we were then able to do was track the participants in relation to the data that had been collected during our experience sampling methodology period, and how they had gone on to, whether they'd gone on to represent teams in the Aviva Premiership, Rugby Union, and potentially competing for their nations as well. So we were able to collect data 5 years later that was naturally occurring data to see if any of the variables during that experience sampling period were related to how many senior professional rugby team minutes they had achieved 5 years later. A lot of findings, but I'm just going to kind of try and touch upon a couple before linking into some implications and also some future work that I'm doing. What we found was at the within person level, so changes over time throughout that 5-week period of the ESM data collection, was that players' daily threat appraisals of organizational events and their harm appraisals were linked to their daily negative affective responses. And in simple terms, this has made a contribution to the sports psychology research on organizational stress, because these relationships have not really been investigated in great detail, and they certainly haven't been investigated from a temporal perspective. We also had almost 20 control variables, which again is quite a significant contribution in sports psychology. And what we found from these different control variables were there were a series of variables that also predicted people's daily fluctuations and their negative affective responses to organizational events. And these were linked to people's stable appraisals over time, and also their neuroticism personality profile. We also found some relationships in terms of people's daily fluctuations in their appraisals of organizational events, predominantly in terms of challenge appraisals, and how that linked to coping approaches in terms of eliciting support from others to regulate one's emotions. Perhaps particularly interesting, what we also found was this 5-year lag in terms of finding that this particular variable in terms of coping was found to be statistically associated with the number of minutes that these players had achieved 5 years later, not just in an academy team, but in a senior professional Aviva Premiership team, which is not necessarily the same team that they were in as an academy team. So some of you might say, okay, so what? So so you've found these statistical relationships. What does this mean, and what contribution might this make in the field? Well, first of all, for those of you that are familiar with REF, I think I'm confident that it's a 3-star paper, depending on who looks at it. It readdresses the imbalance in terms of the sports psychology research that has investigated organizational stress, readdressing the importance of how we evaluate the organizational demands that we encounter in sports. There's also a key contribution in terms of the methodological approach, so looking at how people experience stress on an hourly, daily, weekly basis within their training, their working environments as well. And clearly that the 5-year follow-up is not something that we commonly see linking psychological attributes to selection or performance or talent development success in sports psychology literature at least. And I just wanted to summarize really to say a little bit about what I'm doing currently in terms of my research. linking back to theories of occupational stress, I'm particularly interested in the concept of job crafting at the moment. And this is essentially an occupational health psychology approach to managing stress in the workplace. It's seen somewhere in between a top-down and a bottom-up approach to helping people to manage their work and their work life and stress in general. And I've got a couple of projects at the moment that I've received funding for, but I'm also seeking more funding opportunities to support these project endeavours. We've got some colleagues in this SPARC seminar currently that I'm working with, actually. So one project we're doing currently is a qualitative study looking at job crafting in infectious diseases nurses in relation to how they might job craft through the COVID-19 pandemic, and to look for their recommendations on how their employer can support them to job craft more often. We've also just submitted a research grant application with the British Academy and Labour to support a 2-year multi-study looking at job crafting in Dutch FA, UEFA Pro and A licensed coaches. And that got both a qualitative and a quantitative leg to it. And we've just received some funding from the Research and Innovation SPARC team to conduct some research looking at job crafting, wellbeing and productivity in university lecturers. I'm also having some discussions at the moment with colleagues across the university, not just in nursing midwifery, but also the AWRC, from an occupational health rehabilitative approach, looking at how we can submit a grant in February through NIHR, looking at how we can support the well-being and productivity of nurses. And finally, I've mentioned this in my R&I planner, which I know has been looked at and scrutinised, that there is a significant amount of funding from Nuffield currently. They're interested in research into musculoskeletal disorders, and I can see a lot of scope for conducting job crafting research as part of an interdisciplinary occupational health approach in a variety of jobs where manual lifting is a key issue. So I think I've just about run out of time. It'd be great to have some questions as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Great stuff. Thanks so much, James. Very insightful talk there. Okay, so I get the opportunity to open to the floor for questions. Probably easiest if you unmute yourself. I'll try and look for people raising hands on the participant list as well. Go on, Jeff, I can see you raising your hand there.
James, thanks for some really interesting topics there. Is the potential, I'm just thinking ahead in terms of broadening the reach of this, because you mentioned the business sector. There are opportunities to work with, with the business school and to broaden across organisational management and, some of our partners to look at how this might land from a sports psychology into business perspective, because we're certainly looking at that, things like Spotlight and other coaching areas.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jeff. The simple answer is yes. Perhaps to go into a bit more detail, I'm very keen to collaborate internally and externally. So I have got colleagues at the University of Sheffield in the Institute of Work Psychology that I'm working closely with on some of the funded projects that I've outlined. One of my current and previous colleagues as well, University of East Anglia. But I think as well within the sport department, there are staff in business management that could be very interested in, in working together, and equally the business school as well. So yes, I think there's definitely scope for collaboration.
Thanks, James. No, exciting, good proposition that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.